Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm so happy you're able to take in this really interesting and very thought-provoking conversation. My name is Eleanor Vega, and I'm the chair of the SPJ Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And we are excited and honored to have Professor Barbara Feinman Todd here with us tonight. She is the author of the 2017 memoir, Pretend I'm Not Here, which chronicles her more than 3 decades in Washington, D.C. as a freelance researcher, ghostwriter, editor, and journalist. Some of the books she contributed to are Bob Woodward's Veil in 1987, Carl Bernstein's Loyalties in 1989, and former Washington Post executive editor Ben Bradlee's A Good Life. All really good books. So she's here with us tonight. She is also a professor emerita at Georgetown University, where she taught journalism for 25 years. And she also founded 2 journalism programs, one that we will talk about that was really just a very tough task that she took on that we will talk about in a little bit. And this is dealing with Daniel Pearl. So that'll be like a little tease for you. So Barbara, thank you for joining us tonight. And I know that you have really good weather because I'm on the West Coast also. So we both have really good weather. So I'm sorry for all of our East Coast colleagues, but here we are. So welcome.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's great to be here. And I closed all my window shades so the sun wouldn't be pouring in, so that everybody listening from the East Coast would not hate me.
All right, well, let's get going here. First, I want to know what inspired you to be a journalist?
Well, like a lot of people, I sort of fell into it. I graduated from UC Berkeley with a major in creative writing, with aspirations to become a novelist. And after I graduated, I realized that I had to pay the rent. And so I looked for some sort of a job where I would be in the land of words, but I knew it wouldn't be novel writing and that I would have to do that on the side. And my brother had a friend who was an editor at the Washington Post, and he introduced me to her, and she said I could apply to become a copy aide, which is the non-gendered term for what they used to call copy boys. So I got a job as a copy aide in the Washington Post style section, where I was answering phones and running art down to the composing room. And then, like all the other copy aides, when my shift was over, if there was some kind of a political event, a fundraiser, a party, something at the Capitol or even at the White House, they would send me. I was in sort of a stable of young people who got the opportunity to go and write what they called party stories. And we'd get paid extra because that wasn't part of our shift or our official duties. And so I started getting bylines, and I got, that feeling the first time you see your name in print. I got bitten by the bug, and I fell in love with journalism and being in a newsroom. So that's how it started.
So, I mean, that's quite a meteoric, path to take, right out of school and working at the Washington Post. I mean, how did you navigate a male-dominated newsroom at the Washington Post? Because I would imagine there were very few women.
There were a lot of women. There just weren't there weren't a lot of women in leadership roles, but there were women. And how did I navigate? How did I navigate it? I navigated it kind of clumsily, but I did the best I could. the beauty of it was I was pretty ignorant about how bad things were for women still. This was 1982, and I thought, that I would have no problems, that, women's liberation, all that had come before me. But, I ran up against a lot of challenges. The first one I can remember is a story that I tell in my memoir that I meant as kind of a funny story. But looking back on it, maybe it wasn't that funny. There was a reporter in the style section who was kind of brusque and rude, and especially to the younger people. And he was about to run out to do to a reporting assignment. And he realized he didn't have change for a 20 and he was going to get in a cab. This is before Uber. So he comes over to the bay of copy aids. There were 3 or 4 young women sitting there, all of us fresh out of college. And he said, does anybody have change for a 20? And of course, nobody had change for a 20 because we were 22 years old and we were lucky if we had $5 in our wallet. But I opened up my purse and I dug out my wallet and I had like 1 $5 and then 15 tattered single dollar bills. And so I pull them out and I start counting. And, I think I didn't even have $15 bills. But I had enough for him. And so he threw the 20 in my lap and he said, poor girls always have singles. And he scooped up my single dollar bills and he walked off. And I was really, my feelings were hurt. I felt bad. And then that night I was walking home and I was thinking about what he said, poor girls always have singles. And it became sort of a musical riff in my head. And out of that, I wrote a whole novel that, and I called it Poor Girls Always Have Singles. The novel did not get published. I have not had good luck with fiction, but what it did do for me was it got me my literary agent, who then eventually turned me into a ghostwriter, but I'm sort of hopping it ahead of the story because Woodward, Bernstein, and Bradlee come in between all that. But
well, let's sort of jump then to 1983, which is what you say, was your first big break with Bob Woodward. Why don't we talk about that? How did that become a big break for you?
So what happened was I'd been working in the style section as a copy aide for a year and covering parties on the side. And Woodward advertised internally within the Washington Post that he needed a new research assistant for both him and for the investigative unit that he ran. And so I applied for that job, and it was kind of like that scene in Mary Poppins where all, 30 people line up applying to become the nanny, and a big wind blows and everybody's blown away except for Mary Poppins. I guess I'm Mary Poppins in this story. And so he chose me. And the reason he chose me, he said, was, I didn't have the best resume of anybody or anything like that, but I was the most persistent. I kept coming back to his office. I would leave style and sneak over and pop my head in his office and ask him if he'd made a decision yet. And I guess I was pretty annoying. And he decided that if I would be that annoying to him, maybe I would be that annoying or persistent to his future sources. So he chose me. And so that's how I got my big break.
So when you're working with Bob, you obviously, have a certain image about him. And I mean, in working with him, I mean, what was it that you learned about him? And what was it that also disappointed you about him?
Well, we're going back almost 40 years. What I learned about him was what an incredibly hard, worker he was and presumably still is, and dogged. And the most important thing to him is getting the story. And I learned from him, great work habits and investigative skills. how that you have to be relentless, that you have to go back. I mean, he would send me out to a source and I'd come back with what I thought he wanted and it wasn't enough, and he'd send me back again and again. And so I learned to be extremely persistent and to not give up. And then to answer the second part of the question, what was I disappointed? What did I learn that disappointed me? I wasn't disappointed until later on, more than a decade later, when I had become, at that point, I was a full-fledged ghostwriter. When I worked for Woodward, Bernstein and Bradlee, I was a researcher. So I would do some preliminary editing before it would go to Simon & Schuster. But I was mainly there to do research and help organize material, that kind of thing. So, maybe we shouldn't jump ahead in the story since we're going, I guess, chronologically, but it's up to you.
No, that's fine. You go ahead. We can go and we can jump around.
Okay. So, so I worked for Bob for about 4 years. I worked in the investigative unit for him and about a dozen, maybe 10 reporters, just getting whatever research they wanted. This was pre-internet, pre-Google. So I was actually, working from books and newspaper articles from the Washington Post library. I worked for him for a year doing that. And then he decided he wanted to write a book. It was time for him to do another book. And so he hired me to work on his book. And that was 3 years. That was a book called Veil, and it was about William Casey and the CIA. And when I finished on that book, I didn't know what I wanted to do, because I learned that I loved working on long projects, that I didn't want to be a daily reporter, and I loved books, and I still held on to this at 27. I still held on to this dream of becoming a novelist. So I didn't know what I was going to do, and he suggested that I go up to New York. His friend and Watergate colleague, Carl Bernstein, was late delivering a book to Alice Mayhew, who had been the editor on All the President's Men in the Final Days and was now this legendary editor. And so,
which I understand a lot of people feared.
Alice?
Yes.
She was really scary, really, really scary. I was not afraid of her because she was very nice to me and very generous to me. And it was in her best interest to be nice to me, because I was working for these guys, the 3 in a row, Bob, Carl, and then Ben, who she really needed them to deliver their books on time and all that. And I was sort of, the mole for her. I would tell her, what was going on when I needed to. So, so that is how I got to become a researcher for books. And so I kept doing that. And then I tried to sell this novel, Poor Girls Always Have Singles, that I'd been writing on the side. And I got this terrific agent in New York, and she tried to sell it and she couldn't. And she said, the bad news is I can't sell your novel. The good news is that I've got a client who needs a ghost. It's a congresswoman. And I think you would really enjoy doing it. And as a researcher, you're already doing half the work anyway.
So was that sort of your entry into ghostwriting? Is that how you started, or did you start being a ghostwriter with Bob Woodward? But I know that there's some question about whether you were acknowledged or not about the service you provided.
For Bob, there was never any question about acknowledgement. He acknowledged me. The acknowledgement issue was with Hillary Clinton. And so yeah, that's pretty much the way I became a ghostwriter. I had ghosted one other book through Simon & Schuster, through Alice. But it was part of a book. So this was my big break with ghostwriting. And then a couple of years later, Alice Mayhew recruited me from Simon & Schuster to be the ghost for Hillary Clinton's book. And so that's how I got that, which leads me back to the original question you asked me about the disappointment with Woodward. And that is, so I went to the White House and I worked on Mrs. Clinton's book for 8 months, It Takes a Village. And it was before Monica Lewinsky, but it was during Whitewater. And so
I understand you suggested the title as well, right?
I did, because I was working on a magazine story for something else. And I was interviewing a female head of a record company, and she was juggling all kinds of personal challenges and running this company. And I said, you know, how do you do it all? And she said, well, you know, that old African proverb, it takes a village. And I had probably the only light bulb moment in my whole life where I literally, when I was finished with that interview, ran out of there. This was, you know, I didn't have a cell phone then. It was 1995. I ran out of there and asked to use this CEO's secretary's phone. And I called our editor at Simon & Schuster. It wasn't Alice, it was another editor. And I said, I think I have the title for the book. And then I went through Mrs. Clinton's speeches and I found that she had used that phrase in a speech. So it felt very organic. So I worked on that book for 8 months and it was fine. I mean, you know, it's like anybody who's listening here, any reporters, they know how difficult it is being in the White House and getting information. But, you know, I wasn't there as a reporter. So I had access because I was her ghost, but they were still very careful. And she was also incredibly busy. And so I didn't get enough FaceTime with her. And by FaceTime, I mean the real FaceTime, not FaceTime on your phone, which didn't exist then. So I said to her staff, if you want this book delivered on time, then I really need to spend more time with her. So they invited me over one day for what was supposed to be a debriefing from a trip that she had taken with Chelsea overseas, because they thought maybe I could get some information, some material. And instead, I ended up with these two women who were also visiting the White House, who were friends of hers. I didn't know who they were. And they conducted this therapeutic exercise that eventually the media turned into, they called it a seance, where they had Mrs. Clinton talking to Eleanor Roosevelt and various other people, trying to talk through her feelings. And, you know, I was there and nobody told me not to tell anybody, but I had signed a confidentiality agreement and it was clearly not something that was going to go into this book. It Takes a Village was really about children and public policy. And so I just left the White House after that day and I was like, that was weird. And just thought, wow, that was one of those bizarre ghostwriting moments. And, you know, someday I'll have a funny story to tell. And then I went on several months, finished the book. I went off to, I had a trip planned to go to Italy when the book was over with, as sort of my reward for having written a book in 8 months and, you know, the stress of it and all that. And the day before I was supposed to go to Italy, Woodward invited me to come over to catch up. You know, we had remained in touch with each other and, you know, he had helped me get he got me the Carl Bernstein job and he recommended me to Ben Bradlee and we had stayed, he was my mentor. So I went over for coffee and, you know, I knew what he was doing when he was doing it because I'd worked for him for 4 years. I'd seen him do it to a million other people. He was trying to extract information from me. I just spent 8 months in the White House, you know, in the residence. And I chronicle all this in my memoir. I opened my big fat mouth and I told him about the seance. But I said, but you can't use it. You know, he said, I'll just, you know, it's just to help me understand what was going on with her because she was going through so much. The healthcare debacle just happened. Whitewater was going on, the Whitewater Committee. In fact, the Rose billing records, which was supposed to be the smoking gun for the Republicans, her law firm's legal records were missing. And they ended up, her secretary found them in the room next to the room I was working in. So I ended up getting called, to the Whitewater Committee, being deposed, the whole thing. And so I told him about this. I told him about this bizarre afternoon, but, said, but you can't use this, which is ridiculous. I told, Bob Woodward this juicy morsel about the Clintons while he's writing a book about the Clintons. So yeah, my bad. But I trusted him because he was my mentor, and he said, I'll protect you. And this is just for me to understand what was going on. And, I shared information with him, and I went off to Italy, and I came back, and my apartment had been broken into. And the only thing missing was audio tape that had the words Vince Foster written on it. There were no secrets on it. It was just Mrs. Clinton and I had a conversation about how children were resilient, and she talked about resilience in terms of her good friend Vince Foster, who had ended up killing himself. He had been White House counsel, but that tape was gone, and there was a ceramic plate that was broken, and there was a wine bottle that was turned upside down on the floor, like it was on its, balanced on its stem. So it was a very weird scene. And I called Woodward up and I told him, and he came over.
had you connected the break-in with the information that Woodward
No.
had? No,
I
not.
I had no idea that he had told anybody, because remember, the book hadn't come out yet.
Mhm.
This was September. I told him in August, I think. And the book hadn't come out. And then the next thing I knew, I got a phone call from my agent saying the White House had told Simon & Schuster to withhold my final payment, which was, the final payment was $30,000. I was paid $120,000 in 4 payments. So I had no idea what was going. They suddenly said they weren't happy with my work. There was just like all this Sturm und Drang. It was terrible. And then
in those kinds of situations, because I know that Mrs. Clinton didn't acknowledge you, but in being a ghostwriter, does that make you feel sometimes like a pawn or exploited? Is that kind of like the risk that you run in being a ghostwriter?
So with Mrs. Clinton, it's usually in your contract if you're going to be acknowledged. It's a business, it's part of the business deal. It's not like I need to be patted on the back. Oh, thank you so much. It's your resume. And so you put it on your resume, what books you've worked on, and people can go to the acknowledgements. It's proof you worked on something. And so it's not so much about how you feel. It's more that it's a issue of, business. It's an issue of your reputation and building a career. And so that's why it was a problem. But the reason why, and I didn't know then, but the reason why is they were pissed off that, as well they should be, they were pissed off that I told Woodward. So they tried to withhold the money, which they ended up paying me because they didn't have a legal reason to, because this wasn't out and they didn't know for sure. And I didn't know. Then the book came out and there was, a flap because she hadn't thanked me. So then, and Maureen Dowd wrote a column called, something about Thank You Gate. So it became this whole big thing and I still didn't know what was going on. And then about 6 months later, I think it was June of '96, Woodward's book was coming out, and the night before it was coming out, he called me and said, I just want to give you a heads up. I used that information you gave me. And I went, what? Holy, yeah. So that's how I found out. And, you know, it was heartbreaking to me because I thought of him as my mentor, and I could, you know, I just couldn't believe it. And it took me about 20 years to process it, and then I wrote my memoir.
Mhm. When you're doing these ghostwriting assignments, I mean, what percentage is your writing and what percentage is their writing? And I mean, do they like write anything at all, or are you like taking on the whole assignment by yourself?
So,
And also, you know, how do you deal with the egos? Because I mean, you're dealing with powerful ego-driven personalities, and
yeah.
how do you manage that?
So every single book is different in terms of how much I write, but I want to also be very clear with Bob and Carl and Ben. I didn't write any of their books. That was it was earlier in my career, and I was a researcher, and I did varying degrees of editing for them, and you know, research and brainstorming and organizing, you know, whatever. But every book is different in terms of the books that I actually ghost wrote for different members of Congress and for Hillary Clinton. It just depends on whether or not the person fancies themselves a writer, and also whether or not they have time. So the Bob, Carl, and Ben were all journalists. They were all writers by profession. I mean, Ben was an editor, but in his earlier years, he wrote and reported. But there were several books where I wrote all of it, and they would read it chapter by chapter and fix things and change things. There's been books where they would take the first stab at it, and then I would do rewriting. It just, every single book, you know, it's like every child is different. Every book is different.
And how did you deal with the egos?
God. Well, I moved to Berkeley. Here I am. No, you know, I don't know. Being a woman in Washington in the 80s and 90s, it's you know, you just suck it up. You just did what you had to do, you know, because I wanted to be in a newsroom, and then I wanted to be in books, and you know, I don't know. It's, you just deal with egos, whatever. But I got tired of Washington after being there 36 years. Right after, about a year after my memoir came out, we moved to the West Coast. My husband's from the West Coast, and our daughter is out here. So I was just ready for the weather and to get away from Washington and Trump.
So speaking of your memoir, Pretend I'm Not Here, which was published in 2017, what made you decide to revisit your experience as a ghostwriter and researcher?
You know, there were a few things. One is there was just a lot of good stories. I saw a lot of weird things, and Washington is an unusual place, and I had my own little perch, and I wanted to tell those stories. But I also, you know, on a deeper level, I think that my memoir is really, it's a book about writing, and it's a book about writing aspirations. And I wanted to, you know, I haven't ever devoted myself only to fiction writing, which is what I set out to do. And I felt like I needed to, forgive the psychobabble for a minute, I felt like I needed to process my experiences among all those big egos, and also writing for other people, writing in other people's voices. I felt that sometimes I was losing a sense of myself. And so I wanted to write through that and really reflect on it. And I felt like if I could do that and feel good about it, that maybe I could free up my brain for the more creative things that I wanted to do.
And I mean, did it did it satisfy your need to be a journalist? I mean, it's a different form of journalism, obviously.
Did
But-
what satisfy it?
I mean, being a ghostwriter.
No, they're very different. They're very, very different. And ethically, they're different. You know, the great thing about ghostwriting is you get almost unfettered access. You get to look in them. You're not only allowed to look in the medicine cabinet, you're encouraged to. Now, what you don't have is authorial control. It's because it's not yours, it's theirs. But the access is really great. And the other thing is that the money is really good. And, you know, I for whatever reason, I chose professions that don't pay well. First, I was a journalist, and then I became a professor. And I was a professor at Georgetown University, and I was technically an adjunct because there was no journalism program until I created one. Actually created two, an undergrad and a part-time graduate one. And so, you know, because there was no tenure track or anything like that, the pay was very modest. And so ghostwriting, you know, was something that could pay for our daughter's college, and it could, you know, pay for renovating our little house in Washington. But it certainly didn't satisfy the part of me that loves finding information and digging and, you know, investigative work, which is something I really love. And I think if I had it to do over again, I might be either a detective or a private eye. I love uncovering things. I love secrets, and I love puzzles, putting things together.
We'll circle back to your time at Georgetown in a second, but I want to ask you that the relationship of a ghostwriter and an author, you know, starts out pretty promising.
Yeah.
Because there's there's expectation, there's wonder, especially what the end result will be. But a lot of times it doesn't end the way it began. and so
You should talk Eleanor. That was a very discreet way of saying that. Yeah.
So, you know, I just want to know a little bit of those types of challenging relationships that you might have been faced with.
Yeah. That's great. So, yeah, things can go to hell pretty quickly. And one reason for that is you've got the publishing house that wants, you know, the juiciest, rawest material. By raw, you know, I mean unpolished. And then you've got the author who wants to present themselves in the best possible sanitized, boring light. And so you, the ghostwriter, are the piece of rope being tugged in either direction. And everybody wants to blame you because the author doesn't want to blame the publishing house. You're the little person in this. And so that can happen. And then related to that, when you write, when I would, you know, write a first draft of, let's say, a chapter and show it to them, you know, sometimes it was too realistic. Sometimes I captured their essence too accurately, and they didn't like that. You know, I'm holding up a mirror and there's no filter on it. And, you know, I had one person say to me, "You make me sound like a depressed housewife." And, you know, I was like, well, you're depressed and you're a housewife. So, I mean, I didn't say it exactly like that, but she said it exactly like that. So, if you do your job well enough, you convince the author, and that's what they're called in a contract. In one of these contracts, you're the writer and they're the author. The ghost is the writer and the famous person is the author. If you do your job well enough, you convince them that this is best for the book. And if what they really want is a terrific book, then they'll let their guard down a bit, because I really believe that. I mean, I tried to do that with my own book. I was as honest as I could bear to be, because I believed that people would ultimately see that, yeah, I made a mistake. But in general, I've tried to be a decent human being. And more importantly, for the book, I had some good stories to tell, and I told them as accurately as I possibly could.
What made you end your ghostwriting career? What was the ultimate thing that finally you just said, I've had enough?
I wish there was like one cinematic thing that I could point to, after the Hillary Clinton thing, because it wasn't just the Woodward thing, but it was then having to hire a lawyer because I happened to work in a room next to these papers that were related to Whitewater. It was just, there was a series of bad things that happened. And I decided I was going to quit then, and that was in 1996. And yet I kept going, because then I had a kid, and you have expenses. Washington is expensive to live in. And also, more than that, it would just be, there is an allure to it. Everybody listening here is a journalist. We're all really, really curious people. And being a ghostwriter, you get to find out stuff. And it's really, it can be really fun. You get to go into worlds that you would otherwise not get to go into. And you get the kind of access that I never got as a journalist. And so it's very enticing. So I kept doing it and I'd swear off of it every couple of years. That was another reason I wanted to write the book. I thought, if I write a book and say I've given it up, then I really can't go back to it. So it slowly petered out. When we moved to California 4 years ago, I said, this is it, I'm not going to. And then a big tech guy got a hold of me, and I got sucked in again. But I ended up, I stopped myself. I only did the book proposal. He got a contract, and then he went and found another ghost, and I went on my merry way. So I got to see a different version of that big ego. I got to see the Tech Valley, Silicon Valley.
So your other passion was being a professor at
Yes.
Georgetown.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about your groundbreaking investigation into Daniel Pearl's murder? And I believe it was from 2008 to 2011, because that was something that was pretty revolutionary, that you sort of took a group of undergrad and graduate students to produce this report. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So like most of the interesting things that I've happened upon in my life, this was just, I wasn't looking for it. It sort of fell into my lap. I hadn't yet convinced the university to let me start an undergraduate program. There was nervousness about journalism being too pre-professional for Georgetown. I don't know. So, but I had started a part-time graduate program in journalism, and I wanted to do some big project. At the same time, I was emailing a lot of journalists whom I knew of, I didn't necessarily know, asking them for help, giving more of an opportunity for diversity and inclusion for our students. And one of the people I wrote to was a former Wall Street Journal reporter named Asra Nomani. And she had worked with Danny at the Wall Street Journal, and she was on book leave when Danny came over working on the story in Pakistan. when he came over working on the story that he followed that actually led to his death. And when I emailed her about interest, helping me with a diversity initiative, she was so warm and interesting over email. I said, what are you doing right now? Would you be interested in talking about, maybe teaching a class? And she said, oh, I want to do a project about my friend Danny Pearl. We don't know who killed him. We don't know for certain who killed him. There are people who were arrested and convicted, but I don't I don't believe necessarily that they got his killer. And so I brought her to the university, and one thing led to another. And we started a class, we co-taught it, and we raised a couple $100,000 because, as everybody listening today knows, investigative reporting is the most expensive kind of reporting. And what was supposed to be one semester turned into a couple of years of classes. And then after the classes ended, a couple of the students stayed on. They'd graduated, but they stayed on as fellows. And, we paid them stipends. And we wrote a report that was, that the Center for Public Integrity published. And it got international acclaim. And that's how I was able to start the undergraduate program, because then the dean of the college saw my students on ABC, news, and he emailed me and he said, why don't we have a journalism program? And I said, I don't know, why don't we? So that's how that happened. But, it was 2 years of a really intense investigative journalism. And we had all kinds of professional journalists who would come and school us in how to write a FOIA that can't be ignored. We had pro bono lawyers who we sued a bunch of different government agencies, the FBI, the CIA, because they weren't giving up the documents. And the university got very nervous when we were suing everybody. So, it was something.
I know that, we want to know sort of what you're up to these days. And you had mentioned to me about a diary that you came upon in Massachusetts. And it sounds like a really interesting project. Can you tell us a little bit about what your new assignment has been the last few years?
Yeah, I would love to tell you about it. Thank you for asking. So more than 30 years ago, I was driving from Vermont to New York, and my friend was driving and her car broke down. It was Labor Day, so there was nowhere to go and nothing to do. And I wandered into an antique store, and I ended up buying for $1 a diary from 1872 from the town that we were currently broken down in, Lee, Massachusetts. And the girl, she was 15, she turned 16 during the year that she was writing the diary. And there were all these wonderful gems in it, like, tonight a one-armed peddler came to visit. I'm assuming that was somebody who had been wounded in the Civil War that was 7 years earlier. Then another, and she doesn't really explain things. Another day she says, Mary killed herself today, she ate opium. So who is Mary? Why did she eat opium? I started trying to investigate some of this. And back when I found this diary, which was in the late 80s, we didn't have the internet. It was very hard to do research. I went back to the town. I found this 16-year-old's grave. She lived to be, I think, 83. I tried to fictionalize it and it didn't work. And so I put it down, and 10 years later, I went back, I did a little more research, but I just couldn't make it work. So I put it away. Then during the pandemic, one day, I thought, I'm going to take a look at the diary again. And now that the internet exists, maybe I can find a few things. Well, I've been able to find a lot. And so what I'm doing is I'm writing a nonfiction book. It's kind of a hybrid memoir and around the circumstances of me finding this diary and what was going on in my life then, and why the diary spoke to me so much, and how it fit into my writing. And what do you do when a writing project that you love fails? And can you go back to it, and will something come out of it in another iteration? Those are all things that I'm really interested in. And so I started getting interested again, during the pandemic, and started doing all this research online. And then about 2 months ago, I figured out how to actually write this book. It's just taken me 30 years. So if anybody is kicking themselves because they're having trouble with some story they've been working on for a month or two, think of me. So I'm really having a great time with it. And coincidentally, bizarrely, my brother is moving to the Berkshires about 10 minutes away from where this diary takes place. And so I'm going to have a free place to stay, and I'm going to go this summer, probably in August, and do a bunch of research. But I think my brother and I have been able to find where her name was Libby. I think we found the house, the farmhouse that she lived in. It's still standing. My brother drove by it the other day. So I've gotten him involved in this thing.
And when do you think the book might come out?
I haven't sold it yet. I haven't told my agent about it. I really want, I've got about 15,000 words. I want to have about 30,000 words before I show it to anybody. I want to know what I'm doing for sure before I try and sell it.
So before we go to some of the audience questions, I just want to ask you sort of a philosophical question. And that is, do you think that, being that you have seen so many things in your long and storied career, do you think that we still need journalism? And, should especially young people going into journalism and people that are seasoned journalists that are thinking of leaving, do you think that journalism is still needed and serves a function, especially given social media?
Yeah, no, I think journalism is needed more than ever. And I think it's an incredibly noble calling. And I think the things that we have facing us today, Trumpism, climate change, I mean, you name it. We need journalists telling us the truth, finding out what the truth is. And, social media can be great. I mean, we all have projects we want to promote, and we've got causes, but it isn't in place of journalism. And it's very distressing that there has been this corrosion of what, how people perceive what the truth is. And social media, the internet in general, makes it all more complicated, and we really need social media literacy and news literacy. And so that is a terrifying thing to me. And so I would encourage everybody who's got the stomach for it to stick with it. And it's, when you talk about, what would you say to young people? Well, I was saying it up until 4 years ago, and I still have. I have a million students now in the business, and some of them still come to me for advice. And if you love it, stick with it. You'll figure out how to pay the mortgage. I mean, with the internet and with social media, there are many more ways to monetize what we do with words. We just need to do the right things with words. But if you're ambivalent about it, then I would encourage you to do something else, because it isn't easy. It's long hours. I mean, I don't need to tell you or our viewers. It's hard. It is hard work. But it's the same way if you want a doctor who really believes in practicing good medicine, and you want a lawyer who loves the Constitution. I mean, you want a journalist who just loves the truth and loves good storytelling and loves digging. And if you love all that, it's a compulsion, I think. So, you know, you don't need me to tell you to do it or not to do it. I think for older journalists, you know, that's a tough one. If you're in a situation where you're not being respected and you're not being paid enough, and you've got other opportunities, and, you know, and you, like I did, you get to a point where you've got, you know, a kid or kids to put through college, then, you know, that's a personal decision, and you shouldn't feel bad if you're going to leave the profession, but you should know that it's going to be tough to find something that you love as much if you're a real storyteller. So.
Okay, so we're going to start with the first question that I just got. Do you have, this is from our president, our SPJ president, Rebecca Aguilar. Do you have any regrets or missed out on an opportunity that you wish you would have taken?
Oh, I hate that question. I love that question and I hate that question. You know, there's not one thing that there's not a specific thing, and the things I can think of, I don't want to say, but I can characterize them. And I would say the things that I regret are not taking more chances. That's, and being bolder and being, you know, being bolder and not, and I wish I hadn't been a people pleaser. I wish I had, you know, can I swear on this thing?
I guess a little.
Okay, I won't. I wish I would have told some people to go away. We'll just put it that way. And I wish I had believed more in myself in terms of the fiction writing, and not worried so much about paying the rent, to take more chances. That's what I wish, that I had taken more chances.
Okay, here's another question. Can you tell us about your work on bail and the assignment Bob Woodward gave you to go to CIA director's Bill Casey's, I think it was an anniversary party.
Yeah, it was like,
and then later visit him in the hospital.
Oy vey.
I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that question. So, so I was the researcher on this book about William Casey, the CIA director. It was all during Iran-Contra, and, you know, Woodward didn't have much access to Casey. I mean, he had some, but he wanted more, and he found out that there was going to be this private party that Casey's daughter was throwing for Bill Casey and his wife at, of course, the Watergate. And I was 26 years old, I think, at the time. And I was his researcher, and he thought it would be just great if I would throw on a cocktail dress, hop in a cab, and go on over. And he was discussing this in the newsroom with Ben Bradlee, whom I hadn't really known yet. I knew him walking around the newsroom. I mean, I would watch him walk around the newsroom, but I didn't really know him. And Woodward called him over, and they were talking about me going to this party, this private party, and, you know, crashing the party. And Ben said something like, you know, just, you know, make sure you're home, Woodward, if she calls, if, you know, if she gets arrested or something. So I was terrified. I mean, again, I've mentioned I'm a people pleaser. I'm also like afraid to break rules. And so I went over to the Watergate at the appointed time, and I'm wearing a black velvet cocktail dress, and there's literally like just 40 people, and they're crowded together in this room, and there are these tall tables with drinks on it. And I was the youngest person there by 30 years. So I stood out terribly. And I looked around the room. I went and I got a drink so I could blend in. And I felt this hand on my bare shoulder because the dress was cut like that. And I heard this woman say behind me, "I bet I know who you are." And I turn around to this woman and I said, "I bet you don't." And then I said, "Look, there's Henry." And I swear to God, I'm not exaggerating. And there was Henry Kissinger talking to like 3 people. And I darted over and stuck my head into this crowd of people and was just nodding my head, kind of like that horrible moment. Please don't compare me to her. But when Ivanka Trump is talking to all those world leaders and she's, that's sort of how out of my depth I was. And then Saved by the Bell, they rang the bell and it was time to go in and eat. And it was a seated, with your name card dinner. So I go to the telephone booth and I put in my quarter and I call Woodward, this is before cell phones. And I said, "Okay, I've been running to the bathroom back and forth because I've got a bad memory and I've written down all the names of everybody I could recognize." And I said, I gotta go, I gotta come home now because it's a seated dinner. And he said, "Could you just stay for the toasts?" So I go back in, there's nowhere for me to sit. There's like 5 tables of 8 people at each table. And I'm standing at the back and people are giving toasts. And I'm running to the back and forth to the bathroom, going in a stall, writing down what I can remember. Because I couldn't take out my notebook, I would have looked like what I was, so I get all the, toasts and I go back and I see 2 Watergate employees looking at me and talking. And it's a man and a woman. The woman comes over and she said, "Is everything okay? Why aren't you sitting down?" And I said, "I've got this terrible cough. I don't want to interrupt the toast." So she goes and gets me a cough drop. And then she got suspicious. She brings me the cough drop and I'm still there. I'm not coughing any longer because I have a cough drop. And so I left and she started following me and I took my heels off and I ran, and there was a spiral staircase. I ran up and out and down the street in front of the Watergate. Because I had to get a cab, but I wasn't going to stand there and let them get me and call the police. So that was the first question. The second one was,
it sounds like a movie.
yeah. So, which is one of the reasons I wrote the memoir, because I didn't want to, I didn't want these weird little stories to just, be lost to time. The second part of the question was, so Bill Casey was, towards the end of Woodward working on the book, Casey was dying. He was in Georgetown Hospital. I forgot, he'd had a brain aneurysm or a stroke, an aneurysm. I can't remember, but he was, out of it. And Woodward wanted to talk to him. And so Woodward wanted me to find him because people know in Washington know what Woodward looks like. He didn't want to be wandering around the halls endlessly looking for Bill Casey. So he sent me to the hospital. And I wandered around a little bit and I felt incredibly uncomfortable. Remember, I don't like to break rules. And it just seemed, I don't know, a dying man, me finding him, it felt like a bridge too far. But it was too early for me to go back to Woodward's house. And so I went in the chapel and just sat there, not praying, just sitting there in the chapel. It was quiet, no one was there. And then I went back and I was like, I couldn't find him. So then Woodward went and he did find him, and he had the famous scene where Woodward asked him why he did what he did with Iran-Contra and all that. And he said, "Because I believed." And and then that was disputed because people, his wife and other people said, no, he wasn't able to talk at that point, blah, blah, blah. So, so that was that.
Wow. Well, you have given us a wealth of stories, and this conversation has been so insightful, and you're a great storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to thank you for taking this time to tell us all about your life and also your book. And we just thank you very much for, providing such great insight into the history of journalism. And I wish you all the luck with your new project with the diary. And I can't wait to see, what you do with it. It's going to be fabulous, I'm sure.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. If we've got any people who are watching today who live in the Berkshires, let me know, because I might have an assignment or two for you. I'll pay you.
And I want to thank also everyone who is on this Zoom call. And I appreciate you guys also, spending the hour with us. So thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a good week. And thank you again, Barbara.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.